Right, in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about why I'm picking the Canon 5D Mark II and the lenses that I'm picking to go with it for shooting my landscape photography over the autumn and winter and a little bit into spring into 2025 as well. This video will be more of a chat than sort of an in-depth informative video, but I'm hoping you'll pick up some ideas about this camera as well, what I like about it, why I'm picking it, and maybe how to deal with some of its what would be seen now as quirks, I suppose, but are some of the reasons why I actually like it. Now, firstly, if you're a regular of mine, you'll be saying, why isn't it the 60 Mark I? Well, my 60 Mark I has a couple of issues with it. One is that it has a hole inside of it, which isn't really great when you're going into like Wales, Scotland and the Lake Districts and it's wet. Holes in cameras don't usually do very well. The shutter is wearing out on it. I'm getting that thing where you press the shutter button and it feels like it's getting delayed, and that's usually the sign, because I've worn through so many shutters on cameras over the years, that's usually the sign that the shutter is dying. So I will continue to use this camera until it dies, and then it will go on the shelf. My shelf collection of cameras is cameras that I've killed, not ones that I use. I think that's an important distinction. Right. So let's talk about the 5D Mark II. We'll talk about the camera body, and then I'll get into my lens choices, and I will explain why all of them and not alternatives. So first point, the 5D Mark II has taken my favorite landscape photography images. So the idea that you can sort of quantifiably choose a camera body doesn't really work out that well in practice. So what I mean by that is that you can look at one camera on paper and another camera on paper, and you can make a decision about which camera you're going to use, because you can say that one is objectively better than the other. More dynamic range, better low light performance, those kind of things. Then when you go and use those cameras in practice, you come away liking one camera more than the other, and not just the actual camera body itself, but the results that you get despite its limitations. This is where things get tricky, because as human beings, we like to rationalize things, and we can say that this one thing here is better than something else because X, Y, and Z. But it falls down, and this happens in many areas in our lives when it comes to the actual use case of using that thing. So sometimes we find that the thing that is simpler produces the better results, even though we can make many logical arguments about why the more complicated thing should be better. I can't get around the fact that when I look at my images, despite my 5D Mark II being on paper one of the worst performing cameras I have an overwhelmingly high number of my favorite pictures taken on that camera. And this is partly due to how the files look afterwards. So the lenses obviously contribute to that. The camera bodies make a huge difference. Now, every time I post a video like this, I get emails and comments as well saying, yeah, but if you shoot raw, it's all the same. And my answer to that is no, it's not. It's not the same. The idea that you can match all of the pictures just because everything's raw, the raw doesn't work like that. It's like I can tell whether a photographer is experienced or not by whether they understand that or not. The color production from these Canon cameras, when everyone says, you know, Canon color science, and some people make fun of that term, that didn't come from nowhere. It's almost becoming like a myth now that Canon color science is better. But in these older cameras, it is. The professional world that I've been in my experience, agrees with that. I should probably make a different video on this because there's a lot of caveats to that. But let's say for photographing people in studio environments, most people have agreed with that. When you have an experience where the colors just fall into place where you want them to, very quickly, and it feels easy and fluid and smooth and fast, that gets addictive really quickly. And I found that in the studio with Canon, and I found that in landscape photography with Canon. So if I'm doing landscape photography, I can put the camera on a tripod, right? Which means I can take care of most of the low light situations. I can stay at ISO 100 and just increase my shutter speed however much I need to in order to get my exposures. I think with the classic cameras, the ones that I've rated as being sort of classic sensors, all suffer from not looking like they're going to be a particularly good camera, and then the files that you get back from it just being special, being really, really nice. And everyone who's used them, by and large, says exactly the same thing. So my first main reason, I guess, for picking the 5D Mark II is that it's just an excellent file to work with in the editing afterwards. So let's talk about some of those limitations, workarounds, how I feel about them, and what does that mean. So if I'm picking the 5D Mark II, I have some limitations that are imposed on me. The first one that's the most noticeable for doing landscapes, and probably the most important one, is the dynamic range of the camera. It is limited on the 5D Mark II. There's just no question about that it's limited. For beginners, dynamic range is how much information from the highlights and into the shadows you can capture in a single exposure. So what you can't turn around and say to someone is, well, if you expose properly, you'll get the picture, because you can't do that. It's like me saying to you, there's that bus over there. If you just picked it up, you could move it. If it's outside of your range, you can't do it. Now, there are machines that can lift heavy stuff, and there are machines that can't. And this is a machine that can't. It doesn't have the ability in very high contrast scenes. So again, high contrast is when the brights are really bright and the dark areas are really dark. It can't capture the information in there. So what you'll get is it will just look like it's bright white, when another camera, like let's say a Nikon D800, will capture far more information in the highlights and the shadows when exposed for that. Because with those cameras, you do have to underexpose them a bit to maximize that dynamic range, which seems counterintuitive. But they, like car engines, some of them perform better in the lower rev ranges. That's how Nikon cameras are. They're very good at it. But the Canon 5D Mark II has none of that. So it has a limited dynamic range, and you get around that by bracketing. So you take exposures at different brightness values to make sure you take one, like for instance, one for the highlights, one for the midtones, one for the shadows. Make sure you've got all of that information, all of those exposures, combine them together into one file, and then you make up the dynamic range and you get plenty of dynamic range. And that's not particularly hard to do. Not only that, I often don't use a tripod for that. I've been doing that for years and years, just not using a tripod, because once, many years ago, I decided to try it handheld, and that worked fine. Let's talk about the focus system. This is going to be really brief. I often will manual focus. I will just use the screen on the back on the camera like the 5D Mark II, and I'll just manual focus where I want it to be. I can just zoom in, focus it, and take the picture like that. Or if I'm doing it handheld, I will just focus and recompose using the center focus point, because the center focus point is really accurate and the outside ones are rubbish. Some of the outer focus points work better with certain lenses than others. And the lenses I'm picking, the two main lenses I'm going to be picking for landscapes, actually work well with the outer focus points. So in theory, I could use those as well, but I'll probably just center focus and recompose, because I'm probably going to be shooting at like f4 to f8 or f11. It doesn't really matter. So the focus system is not a limitation for what I want to use this camera for. The screen on the back of the camera is actually good. It's not particularly high resolution. The 5D Mark II screen has a more even brightness across the screen. I really like the screen on the back of it. So it works well for composing your photos. I suppose the next thing we should talk about is the weather sealing on it. This, again, when you look up the 5D Mark II, a lot of camera companies are really limited in the way they discuss the weather sealing in their cameras, and the 5D Mark II is definitely no exception to that. It's protected a bit against moisture and dust. But one thing that we have with the 5D Mark II that we don't have on some of the newer cameras is we have like more than a decade's worth of hundreds of thousands of user experiences with this camera. And we know, because that's like the best testing you could ever do, that this is a really tough camera body. I remember the first time I held it, I wasn't convinced on that. I was like, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure how strong this camera is. It feels just kind of ordinary. But it's proved itself. It's proved itself in weddings. It's proved itself in really cold environments, damp environments. I've had this out in some pretty horrendous conditions many years ago, and it's performed really, really well. So I think that the weather sealing on it is really good. Now, one, it's not really a downside, I suppose, but you will need the CF cards for it, which are the larger ones. It's not the new CF Express things. You'll need these. Sometimes people say that the connector pins get bent inside the camera or inside the card reader. If you get a new CF card, I've never had problems with the new ones. Like they're not new now, but I mean is like the more modern ones that you can get. They must have changed something in the way the cards works, because that never happened to me again beyond a certain time point. So before we move on to the lenses, what I would sum up for you and say is that whilst the camera has some obvious limitations, it's clear to me that I know that I can work around all of them as long as I've got a tripod. And I'll explain a couple more things in a moment as we go into some of the lenses as well. Yeah, so the tripod will take care of all of the issues. So the lenses that I'm going to take, the first one I'll talk about briefly is the 16-35 f4 IS. If you don't have the budget for that, get the 17-40. I used the 17-40 for years. The only reason I have the 16-35 is because I want to be able to do bits of video with it. The 5D Mark II does actually pretty nice 1080p video that's still fine for YouTube nowadays. And I want to be able to do some wide shots, some panning shots sometimes, and having the stabilization in the lens makes all the difference, because obviously there's no stabilization in the camera body. But optically, it is better than the 17-40. But really not by much, and most of it's in the corners. So if you want to save yourself some money, get the 17-40, and I can tell you now that if it weren't for doing those bits of videos, I probably wouldn't have bothered buying this lens. There is one small other advantage to this lens, and that is that it has image stabilization in it, and that allows you to get away with longer handheld exposures before needing to go through the performance of getting the tripod out. And it also means that it's easier to do bracketed exposures without a tripod, because the camera is going to be more steady. So if that matters to you, then I think it is actually worth spending a bit more and getting that lens. But it's an excellent lens, and it's one of the reasons as well that I think that Canon actually makes a really good argument for being a landscape photography system, because when you look across the board at the competitors, like for instance the Nikon 16-35 f4, that thing is at least, it must be twice the size and twice the weight of this. It is an absolute monster of a lens. It's optically definitely nowhere near as good as this one. And the Canon lens is just lighter, smaller, and a far superior lens all around. I think it's really good. It's a very good option for people. And that brings me on to the next lens, which is the 16-35. It's the 17-200 f4 IS. Image stabilized. It's the original version of it. It's not the newer one where they upgraded some of the coatings and didn't really do very much. That's such a Canon thing to do? Like that upgrade that they made on this lens, all the paint's a bit whiter and we put a coating on the front and basically everything looks the same, but buy it. That's the most Canon thing in the world to do. That just sums up their strategy, I think. Anyway, this is optically an excellent lens. I think it's one of the best lenses that has been made by a DSLR company, by the brand that makes the camera, like Nikon, Sony, Canon, like that. Because the bang for buck that you get with this is unsurpassed, and optically, this will keep up with anything, really. It's that good, and it still holds its own by today's standards easily It's superb, and they're on the used market. There's loads of these things around and they're cheap. And look how small and light this is. I would say get the lens with the VR in it. The optical quality of all the f4 lenses is pretty much identical. It's not really going to make any real world difference for you when you buy them, but the VR, the vibration reduction and the image stabilization in the lens is really worth it. And you may think to yourself you're always going to be on a tripod, but when you've got access to the VR in the lens, you probably won't be, because I think it's limiting a little bit to be on the tripod all the time. It's nice to be able to just handheld, especially when you're doing do things that are sort of more unusual angles. You just want to grab the shot quickly. It's worth spending that little bit extra for the VR. There is a gap in this lineup between 35 and 70. And that would normally be filled with a 24-70 or 24-105. I should speak about the 24-105 as well. I nearly thought just use the 24-105 and be done with that, but I thought I want to do something a little bit different, and I'm not going to bring anything in the in-between gap apart from a prime lens. And my reason for doing that is because it's just going to add on more extra weight. Usually I can move that bit of difference. The 24-105 would have been perfect as well as a standalone lens for this setup. I just feel like I haven't gone with just this setup before. I've often done the 24-105 thing. So let's mix it up a bit and do something a bit different. The other lens I'm going to be taking with me is this one, the 50mm or 1.8. It's the STM version. And the reason I'm bringing this is because it is pretty slap bang in the middle between 35 and 70. So it does give me that. If I'm finding there's a shot that really is right in the middle and I can get it right, just right in camera, I will bring this out and use it. But it's just such a small lens that it's almost kind of like a no-brainer to take it. So that's my fill the gap between the two lenses lens. Don't even know if I'll use it at all. Check out this video if you want to see a previous shoot of me using the 5D Mark II.